You've mentioned addiction. Maybe we could take a little bit detour into a darker aspect of things, or not even darker. It's just an important aspect of things. What's the nature of addiction? You've mentioned some things within the big umbrella of psychedelics, maybe usually not addictive, but maybe MDMA, I think you said, might have some addictive properties. But the point is, stuff outside of the psychedelics umbrella can often be highly addictive. So you've studied addiction from several angles, one of which is behavioral economics. What have you understood about addiction? What is addiction from the biological, physiological level to the psychological, to whatever is the interesting way to talk about addiction?
Yeah, and the lenses that I view addiction through very much are behavioral economic, but I also think they converge on, I think it's beautiful at the other end of the spectrum, sort of just a completely humanistic psychology perspective. And it converges on what people come out of 12-step meetings talking about.
Can you say what is behavioral economics and what is humanistic psychology? What do you mean by that? And more importantly, behavioral economics lens. What is that?
Yeah, so behavioral economics, my definition of it is the application of economic principles, mostly microeconomic principles. So understanding the behavior of individual agents surrounding commodities in the marketplace, applying microeconomic types of analyses to non-economic behavior. So basically, at one point, like psychologists figured out that there's this whole other discipline that's been studying behavior. It just happened to be all focused on monetary behavior, spending and saving money, et cetera. But it comes with all of these principles that can be wildly and fruitfully applied to understanding behavior. So for example, I've studied things like demand curve analysis of drug consumption. So I look at, for example, the tobacco, cigarettes, and nicotine products through the lens of demand curves, and in other words, at different prices, if there's different work requirements for being able to smoke cigarettes, sort of modeling price.
Within that price data, there is some indication of addiction, how much the habits that you form around these particular drugs.
It's one important dimension. So I think a particularly important one there is elasticity or inelasticity, two ends of the spectrum. So that's the price sensitivity. So for example, you could have something that's pretty price inelastic, like gasoline. So the price of gas at times can keep going up, and Americans are just going to pretty much, buy the same amount of gas. Or maybe, the price of gas doubles, but their consumption only decreases by 10%. So it's a sub-proportional reduction. So that's an inelastic. And that changes. Like, you push the price up high enough. I mean, if it was $100 a gallon, it would eventually turn. The curve would turn and go downward more drastically, and it would be elastic. But you can apply that to someone who a regular cigarette smoker who is working for cigarette puffs, who's gone 6 hours without smoking, and you're asking questions like, how many times are they willing to pull this knob in the lab during this 3-hour session? I do a lot of work like this in order to earn a cigarette puff. How does the content of nicotine in that affect it? How does the availability of nicotine replacement products like nicotine gum or e-cigarettes affect those decisions? So it's a certain lens of, it's sort of a way to take the kind of the classic behavioral psychology definition of reinforcement, and which is just basically reward. How much is this a good thing? And it kind of breaks that apart into a multi-dimensional space. So it's not just the idea is reward or reinforcement is not unidimensional. So for example, you can unpack that with demand curves. At a cheap price, you might prefer one good to another. So the classic example is luxury versus necessity. So diamonds versus toilet paper. So at those cheap prices, you can look at something called intensity of demand. If it was basically as cheap as possible, or essentially zero, how much would you buy of this good? But then you keep jacking up the price, and you'll see. So diamonds will look like the better reward at at that low price sort of intensity of demand side of things. But as you keep jacking up the price, you got to have some toilet paper.
Yes.
Okay, we can get into the whole like bidet thing, but forget that. Like
Yeah.
I know Joe's been pushing that too. but you're gonna hang on and keep buying the toilet paper to a greater degree than you will the diamonds.
Yes.
So you'll see a crossing of demand curves.
Yeah.
So what's the better reinforcer? What's the better reward? Depends on your price,
Yes.
And so that's an example of one way to, and that of look at addiction. So specifically drug consumption, which isn't all of addiction, but it's like, in order for something to be addictive, it has to be a reward, and it has to compete with other rewards in your life. And one of the two main aspects of addiction, in my view, and this doesn't map onto how the DSM, the psychiatry Bible, defines addiction, which I think is largely bunk, but there's some value to have some common description. But it's, how rewarding is it from this multi-dimensional lens? And specifically, how does that rewarding value compete with other rewards, other consequences in your life?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not a problem if the use of that substance is rewarding. Okay, yeah, you like to have a couple beers every once in a while, and it's like not a problem. I mean, but then you have the alcoholic who is drinking so much that it tanks their career, it ruins their marriage. It's in competition with these pro-social aspects to their life.
It's all about comparing to the other choices you're making, the other activities in your life, and if you evaluate it as a much higher reward than anything else, that becomes an addiction.
Right. And so it's not just the rewarding value, but it's the relative rewarding value. And in the other major aspect, again, from behavioral economics, the thing that makes addiction is something called delayed discounting. So in economics, sometimes it's called time preference. It's what compound interest rates are based upon. It's the idea that delaying a good, access to a good or a reward, comes with a certain decrement to its value. So we'd all rather have things now than later. And we can study this at the individual level of, would you rather have $9 today or $10 tomorrow? And when you do that, you get huge differences between addicted populations and non-addicted. Not just heroin and cocaine, but like just cigarette smokers, like normal everyday cigarette smokers. And even when you look at something like monetary rewards, and so you can go into the rabbit hole with this delay discounting model. So it's not only those huge differences that seem to have a face valid aspect to it, like the cigarette smoker is choosing this thing that's rewarding today, but I know it comes with increased risk of having these horrible consequences down the line. So it's this competition between what's good for me now and what's good for me later. Mm-hmm. And the other aspect about delayed discounting is that if you quantitatively map out that discounting curve over time, so you don't just do the, how much, that $10 tomorrow, how much is it worth to you today? So you can say, what about $9? What about $8? What about $7? And you can titrate it to find that indifference point. And so we can say, aha, $6, $10 tomorrow is worth $6 to you today. So it's by the one day, it's decreased by 40%. We can do that also at 1 week and 1 month and 1 year and
Mm-hmm.
10 years and map out that curve, get a shape of that curve. And one of the fascinating things about this is that whether you're talking about pigeons making these types of choices between a little bit of food now or a little bit of food a minute from now, or rats, or dozens of species of animals tested, including humans, the tendency is pretty consistently that we discount hyperbolically rather than exponentially. And what exponentially means is that every unit of time is associated with the same proportional reduction. Every unit of delay is associated with causes the same proportional reduction in value. Mm-hmm. And that's the way the compound interest rate, works, that there's, compound every day, you get this sort of out of whatever value's in there at the beginning of that day, you get this, we'll give you this amount of extra money to compensate you for that delay. Mm-hmm. But then the way that all animals tend to function is of this very different way, where the reductions, that initial delay, so like 1 day's worth of delay, you see a much stronger discounting rate or reduction in value than you do over those. So you see the super proportional, then it changes to these lesser rates. And so the implication of that, I know I've gone like really into the weeds quantitatively, but what that means is that there's these preference reversals. When you have curves of that nature, the decay that's hyperbolic, it maps onto this phenomenon we see, both in terms of how people deal with future rewards, but also how perception works. When two things are far away, whether it's physical distance or whether in terms of perception or whether it's in terms of time, when you're really far away, the subjective value for that delayed reward is larger. So for example, like, let's say we're talking about 364 days from now, you can get $9, or 365 days a year, now you get $10. And you're like, dude, it's a year, like no difference. Like, why not get one more dollar?
Yeah.
You bring that same exact set of choices closer. Nothing's changed other than the time to both rewards. And it's like, would you rather have $9 today or $10 tomorrow? And plenty of people would say, just about the same, let's go ahead and take it today.
Yeah.
So you see this preference reversal. And so that's a model of addiction, in the sense that consistently with true addiction, I would argue, you see this competition between molar and molecular utility. It's like intrapersonal, like within the person, competing agents. Someone sometimes has control of the bus that wants to do what's good for you in the short term, and someone at other times is in control of driving the bus, and they want to do what's good for you in the long term. So you tell you're trying to quit, and you see a doctor, you see your 12-step therapist, and say, God, I know this stuff is killing me. Like, I'm on the path. I'm done. And that's when you're kind of in their office or wherever you're not, it's not around you. And then later on that day, your buddy says that, hey man, I just scored. I got it right here. Do you want it? And that reward is right in front of you. That's like bringing those two choices right in front of you. And it's like, hell yeah, I want to use.
Yes.
And then you can go through that cycle for like years of the person telling themselves, I want to quit. But then at other times, that same person is saying, I don't want to, functionally they're saying, I don't want to, because they're saying, give me some.
So in the moment, it's very difficult to quit.
And this isn't just something, this is something that has huge clinical ramifications with addiction, but it's like all humans do it. Yes. Anyone who's hit the snooze alarm in the morning, the night before, they realize, oh, I got to get up extra early tomorrow. That's what's ultimately better for me. So I'm going to set the alarm for, 5 a.m.
Yes.
And it goes off at 5 a.m., and then, so now those two consequences have come sooner, and it's like, what the hell? And they hit the snooze alarm. And sometimes not just once, but then 5 minutes later, and then 5 minutes later, and so, and it's why it's easier to exercise self-control at the grocery store compared to in your fridge. Like, if that snack is like 30 seconds away in your fridge, you're going to more likely yield to temptation than if it is further away.